replicated
My good God.
additions that you try to feed in.
Well, you're not going to believe this, Alan. After
It's working.
telling us that we're not verified, they're now saying they're setting up our live feed. So,
Oh.
So we are live feeding now.
Great.
So, excellent. Okay, let's just see that.
Excellent.
Right, okay, got it. Right, okay. Right. Okay, so well, you're not going to believe this, Alan. After telling us that we're not verified, they're now saying they're setting up our live feed. So, so we are live feeding. I'm killing that one off so that we don't have a duplication all the way through. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, for turning up. It's good to see so many people here. Hopefully, we'll get one or two more people joining during the course of this. We've got Alan Simpson, ex sort of Nottingham South MP. I think it was from 1992 to 2010, was it, Alan, that you were?
Yeah, 18 years, less for murder.
So first time I met Alan was when I was going with my brother to see my local MP about a hydrogen energy plan he had. And we'd spoken to several people in the Labour Party, and then Theresa Pearce, who was the MP at the time, organised for Alan to come down and have a conversation with us. And I think we spent 2 hours sort of in a meeting with Alan, and it was quite detailed and quite a full-on meeting, but it was excellent. And then I saw Alan writing a couple of articles in the Morning Star, and they were really sort of quite something. So I thought we'd invite him along, and thankfully we got a yes from Alan. So I'm going to say now, after that, over to you, Alan, and sort of take it away, sir.
Well, thanks, Tim. Thanks for setting this up, and thanks for everyone who resisted the allure of Qatar versus Ecuador kicking off the World Cup finals. If I can start from somewhere else, but it's not in Qatar, it's what's come out of Sharm el-Sheikh and COP27. I suppose the good news, the silver lining, is that at long last, there's some sort of international agreement about in a sense, the repair and damage, the loss and damage commitments to those parts of the developing world that are really at the front line of climate collapse. And so that has to be welcome and is long overdue. The sad news is that it seems to come at the cost of any sort of commitment to a timetable for either 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade, and no commitments to move beyond the fossil fuel era. And that's a real tragedy for all of us, because it means that precisely the same sort of issues that have dragged us into the edge of a real catastrophic upheavals are still calling all the shots. And so for the rest of us, I think we need to take a big step back and do the sort of fundamental rethink that you have to do when events happen that are no longer within your control. And it's all very well making a big brouhaha about the disruptive activities of the Just Stop Oil protesters. But, I didn't see Hertfordshire police going out and arresting the floods that closed all the roads in the downpours, or, that arresting the heat that brought things to a halt over the summer. And this is much more disruptive than the actions of individuals who are trying to get a political message, which is wake up, while we still have time. In a sense, let me start with the Just Stop Oil protest. My only disagreement there is maybe we're just not doing the targeting right, because if you want to look at what did or did not happen in Egypt, the thousands of lobbyists there acting on behalf of oil corporate oil interests are the ones that we ought to be targeting. And yet they seem to be the ones, who can breeze into the conference chamber, who can breeze into the working groups and can place a dead hand on any plans to try to move into a different space. And they, rather than members of the general public, are the real stumbling block at the moment. And that's where I think we need to put our focus. But we also, and this is where socialist conversations come in, I think the obligation on those of us who want to change the world for the better really have to address what the better is. And I just think we can't afford any longer to be oppositionalists in our politics. We have to be propositionalists. We have to be able to set out something that is a better and more attractive alternative, or a safety zone that large numbers of the population will gravitate towards. Because if we don't, that space will be taken up by the likes of Nigel Farage, who will just play on insecurities to fan up divisions that in the end will set us against ourselves. And the people in the past who said, capitalism is just like a boxing match that is set up where two members of the working class get into the ring and beat hell out of each other for the entertainment of the affluent spectators outside. And we have to occupy a space that is well beyond the notion that all we're fit for is beating each other up. So that positive space is where I've been trying to set out ideas and arguments, some of which involve a political rethink. I think
Yeah.
okay, sorry, I'm competing with someone.
I don't know who that is in the background.
It was in London, that's fun, wasn't it?
Is there?
No.
We'll do that. Okay. Well, should we go for a little second holiday somewhere? Oh, that'd be great. Yes. The weather's a bit better.
Sorry, Alan. I tried to mute somebody else and sort of muted you inadvertently. So
I've muted them, Dave. Yeah.
you did, yeah. Thank you, mate. Sorry, Alan. Carry on.
All right. So the question then is, how do we build an inclusive politics that offers examples of where people need to be moving and rapidly? And that's a lot of the work that I did both when I was in Parliament and then after leaving, working with John Mack and Jeremy in writing a different climate politics, and what I continue to do now. And some of that involved just taking MPs to see what is already happening elsewhere, because I think we have to be able to deliver this in our own localities, and it has to be more than abstract and theoretical. I think one of the things that was really good for me during my time as an MP and before that as a community worker, what I realized is that as a society, we're not particularly either academic or abstract. Knocking on doors, trying to run ideas past people, often you'd see them very quickly glaze over. And they'd sort of nod with you, but you knew that wasn't a conversation that was going anywhere. When we came back with examples and images of things that we ought to be doing in our own areas, but which were already being done elsewhere, the reaction was, well, why haven't we got one of them? If they can do that, why can't we? Why aren't we? And so that sense of seeing what is being done elsewhere is a really useful side. So I just want to focus on two aspects of transformational change, and then looking at the economics that would make both of those possible. The first is energy, and some of this involves reclaiming our own understanding of our own history. And my starting point is 1817 in Manchester, or as we used to say in Liverpool, bloody Manchester, because the police, that revolutionary organisation known as the Manchester Police, put a gas lamp on the outside of the police station on the corner of Water Street in Manchester, and people, gathered round, from visiting it from miles around, standing outside, looking at this flickering little amber light, and going, "Oh, marvelous, isn't it marvelous? We'll never catch on, mind you, but marvelous, marvelous." But within 10 years, that had become the Manchester Municipal Gas and Water and Electricity Company. And it was the first of what turned out to be 60 odd years or more of the growth of municipal energy companies all around the country. Birmingham, one, London, Bristol, Glasgow, Edinburgh, they all just replicated and delivered energy security for their own localities. And what happened was that they were funded by the issuing of municipal bonds. People, the rich people, could put 100 quid in. Middle class could put 5 to 50 quids. The poor could put in as little as 50p. But anyone could join in that process of putting their savings into municipal bonds, which weren't speculative, but they provided an upgrade in the energy security of the area. It provided a safe place for them to park their money. And the proceeds of all of those public enterprises, the energy utilities enterprises, actually paid for the whole era in which we saw towns and cities build parks, libraries, swimming baths, museums. All of these were built out of the proceeds of revenues and profits that were made out of the municipal ownership of the public utilities. So you didn't have to go to speculative investors in the City of London. You allowed municipal bonds to finance the development of municipal utilities that kept us all safer. And they delivered real qualitative improvements in the nature of civic life. Now, when I remind people of that, my next thing is to do a big leap forward and say, just look at what Germany has been doing post 1945, that in order to stop their national rearmament, we required the German political structure to be largely federal in nature. Central government makes a policy, but then it's for regional and local governments to work out how to deliver it. And as a result of that, they now have hundreds of municipalities running their own energy companies. And that has allowed them to develop local energy grids and also to drive the shift into renewable energies. Much of this went back to a little village in southern Germany called Schönau, where post the Chernobyl disaster, the local citizens went to the energy company and said, we'd just like to be buying non-nuclear electricity. And the energy company said, push off, you'll buy what we supply you with. If you don't like it, you buy the energy company and you run the grid yourselves. And laughingly threw them out the room. Well, there was this magical woman called Ursula Schladek, who was a primary school teacher at the time, who was so furious about this that she and her husband actually set about trying to do precisely that. It took them 5 years. And first of all, they had to win the right to bid to take over the energy company when the franchise came up for renewal. And then they put out an appeal around Germany, and people just donated money to raise the cash for the community to buy the grid, and they won. And that was the start of this proliferation of local energy grids, increasingly based on the delivery of clean renewable energy. And currently, the big energy corporates, there are 4 in Germany, they own just 5% of the renewable energy investment that's been going in. The rest is owned by individuals and communities. And the key thing that makes a difference, and when I took groups of Labour MPs around Germany to look at this, we'd go around a community, knocking on people's doors on a random basis and saying to them, well, you've got all these solar roofs here and you've got these wind turbines all around the village. Don't you find them a bit ugly? And they'd say, no, look, we've all got to do our bit for the planet, haven't we? And it would come down to us to say, and does the price make a difference? At which point they all laughed, because this was this was the deal maker. What happens in Germany is they've got a right of local supply. So villagers can generate electricity and sell it back to themselves at much closer to wholesale prices than retail. And the last time I took a group of MPs there, we went to a village called Feldheim, just outside Berlin, and they were selling their electricity back to themselves at 13 euro cents a kilowatt. In Berlin, they were paying 27 euro cents a kilowatt. So anyone who can cut their energy bills in half by saving the planet, by going clean and green, they all describe this as acting ethically and in the interests of the planet. But they also knew that this was the way of cutting their energy bills in half. And one guy on the doorstep said to me, look, we Germans, we're not better than you Brits and describing what a ton of carbon might look like, but we can recognize a check when it comes through the post. And they were absolutely spot on. This was a way in which, by acting ethically and responsibly, they were able to move to a local energy system that would save them money, radically cut carbon emissions, and develop a real sense of collective ownership and local accountability. In Denmark, they've gone a step further. After the 73 oil crisis, which pretty much paralyzed the whole economy, they just said, we can't go into this space again and expect to survive. So they changed the law. And this one really stopped some of the Labour MPs in their tracks. They changed the law post-73 to say energy should not be considered as a market. It's a service. And so it's illegal for energy to be sold for a profit. They can sell it to cover the cost of production, the maintenance of system, and the improvements of the system. And that's it. And the way in which it's organized and delivered is exactly the same way. You have basically 3 major Danish cities running municipal energy companies and about 78, 79 other groupings of localities that operate as cooperatives. And they all have to deliver combined heat and power solutions for the running of energy systems in Denmark. And it's one of the most secure and reliable in the whole of Europe. And we could do the same. I mean, you have some villages that generate huge surpluses. And what do? Well, they put it into a local grid management company, which is also collectively owned. And that company manages that they supply surpluses to neighboring districts and boroughs. And all of that is in the context of delivering mutuality and security in their energy, meeting their energy needs. Some of the innovations that are taking place at the moment really take this on a huge step. So that in the Netherlands, it's not just about electricity, but also about heating. There's a town called Heerlen, and they were looking at we know how we can keep the lights on, but how do we keep people warm? And someone said, well, we had a coal mine that used to get the coal to keep people warm. And they started having a look at this and thought, actually, in the galleries beneath the coal mine, they're now flooded with permanently hot water. So they worked out a system whereby they drill down with sealed pipes that pumps water through the system, pumping down the cooled water, pump back up water that's been heated from within the hot water in the galleries. And from that, they have heat pumps on the surface, and they provide heat, district heat, for the entirety of the town. I contacted the British Geological Society in Loughborough to say, well, if we wanted to do that in the UK, how would it look? It turns out that we've got something like 25,000 disused and abandoned mines flooded, with a capacity to deliver everlasting renewable heat for people, for towns and localities. And 1 in 4 of the households in the UK are estimated to be within reasonable supply distance of that sort of approach. And I just thought, there we are sitting on resources which would give a new and different life to disused mines, which we've just not bothered to even consider, partly because the nature of these doesn't allow for big corporate dominions. They are, by their very nature, localized resources that need to be put into localized systems. And that has been the big objection that the lobbyists for the fossil fuel sector have fought against. When I introduced feed-in tariff amendments to the 2006 Energy Act, Ed Miliband asked me afterwards if I'd just come and advise him and effectively give him all the advice that his civil servants weren't giving him. And I said, yeah, fine, I'll do that. And then I discovered that they actually didn't, the departmental officials didn't want me coming into DEC because they said I just upset them. And I said, well, I understand that. But one of the things that upsets them is that, I do like to point out that you've got me putting one side of the argument. And at the same time, there are 100 people seconded from the big 6 energy companies into your department and Downing Street, actually helpfully trying to write the laws that will produce sensible energy policies. But they're only sensible in that they meet their needs. And they're not sensible if you want to make the radical shift into a renewable post-fossil fuel era. But that is what we're up against, the very detailed organized structure that blocks the moves in this country, either to energy accountability, to restored and decentralized democratic systems of management, and a rapid shift into post-carbon economics. So that is where I think we have to start on energy. And some of this then translates into the second part of what I want to say, which is, how are we going to feed ourselves? And you can see from the events of this year that the climate roller coaster, the wild weather, has created. We didn't need to wait for Putin's war in Ukraine to see the destruction of all sorts of harvests in all sorts of places around the globe. And so what we're going to be faced with is a fundamental rethink of how we feed ourselves and how we provide energy, food security, at the same time as radically cutting the carbon footprint of the foods that we consume. Because if we want to avoid that sense of going from a roller coaster to a complete breakdown, we're going to have to be cutting our carbon emissions by 10% a year for the rest of this decade and probably the decade that follows. And economists struggle to know what on earth that means or how to deliver sensible answers to doing that, because carbon reduction or carbon accounting has never been part of the way the Treasury has thought about things. But there are some really good examples of the where and how of doing that. And I want to just offer you one as a starter for my own experience here in Nottingham, where this fantastic guy came in as the catering manager for the combined University Hospitals Trust, the two hospitals in Nottingham. And he was a quiet bloke, came in, he was there for about 6 months, came back to the trust board and he said, look, I can save you £2 million straight away, and then £250,000 a year on our food bills, at the same time as doubling the nutritional value of hospital food. And the board looked back, sounds great. Are there any drawbacks to this? Well, why aren't we doing it now? And he said, well, there is a bullet that you've got to bite, and that is you'd have to be willing to throw out the cooked chilled food suppliers that you currently rely on, that actually provide not a very good deal in nutritional terms and not a very good deal in cost terms. But I can now guarantee that I can provide that food from a consortium of farmers that we've pulled together that covers Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, Leicestershire and Lincolnshire. And we can guarantee that food supply all year round. And as I say, it will double nutritional standards, save £250,000 a year in costs. And also we will cut the food miles involved in this process by 90%. So we said, yeah, great, go give it a run. And he did. And it was so successful that Prince Charles, polled up and gave them an award setting the gold standard for hospital catering services. It was brilliant until 2010. And then post 2010, the coalition government decided that this was an unfair, anti-competitive approach. So they said it has to be put out to tender, and the in-house catering team weren't even allowed to put in a bid. It went to Quadrilla on a ludicrous bid that the hospital catering manager said they can't do it for this money. If you accept it, you'll only get about 6 to 9 months before they come back and they'll ask for more. And the hospital said, no, we've got a guarantee on this. Sure enough, within the year, Quadrilla came back and said, we're going to have to surrender the contract because we can't make it work for this price. And of course, by that time, the hospital had no fallback catering provision. So they just had to agree to the increase in prices that Quadrilla demanded until Quadrilla went bust. But it just showed that if you allow for a different approach, we can ourselves deliver radically more carbon reducing, cost effective, locally accountable systems of food supply that are already being replicated elsewhere. But we have to demand that localities are given the powers to drive that change. And to do that, we just have to pinch ideas that you can find all over the place. And the rest of Europe has a fantastic tradition. It's called the slow food movement. Their towns and cities have been doing exactly this for decades. And what they do is they, in a sense, they restore the notion that our diets are much more in tune with the seasonality of what the land can produce. But also their lines of accountability are stronger. And as many of the mayors that I went to see in Italy, as they pointed out, even the poor in Italy have better diets than the middle class in Britain, because the nature of food accountability is that much stronger. In Belgium at the moment, what you've also got is this really interesting initiative taken by the Liège local authority, which has helped to form a number of cooperatives amongst farmers and farm communities. And they finance the working of the cooperatives. And the remit is that within the next 5 years, 50% of the region's food has to come from within the region itself. And the radical carbon reductions that are coming from that are absolutely massive. But it doesn't stop there, because we're also going to have to get back to the notion of what does urban agriculture mean in a time of turbulent climate change. On this, again, I want to just ask you to turn the clock back. It was before any of you were born, so I'll have to just appeal to your imagination rather than your memory. But in the Second World War, Britain was producing 6 times as much food per acre from within our towns and cities than from the countryside, mainly because there were no workers left in the countryside to do the farming. But we commandeered bits of derelict and abandoned land, and people grew food to feed themselves and their neighbours on that land. We saw a huge burgeoning growth in the use of allotments. And so that was the sense of public acquisition of land to grow food to feed local populations. What's happening now is that there are cities all across both Europe and North America that are beginning to do the same, but in some genuinely innovative and exciting ways. And the one that really strikes me, my wife is from Montreal. Now they have a different sense of seasons to us. She always looks somewhat, pityingly at me when I say, "Oh, look, it's the snow." And she says, it isn't snow till it's about 3 foot deep, because their winters go down to -30. So when we talk about cold, it's, she just again looks somewhat contemptuously at me and says, you don't understand winters. But in that context, they've had conversations in the city about how do we reduce our food miles when so much of the food produce has traditionally been imported, and we don't give any more thought to it. And there's some really remarkable people who set up a thing called Loofah Foods, and they acquired and commandeered the roof space on flat roofed buildings, and they built huge industrial greenhouses as an additional layer on top of the factories. And they take the hot air as stale that comes out of the factories, they use it just to provide warmth in the greenhouses, and they are doing vertical gardens and growing food agroponically. And this, sounds novel and interesting, but it breaks beyond that when you realize that as things stand now, that group of food activists are now producing over 20,000 shopping trolleys of food per week for people living in Montreal. And this is now happening. Vertical agriculture in towns and cities is happening in Berlin, it's happening in Paris, it's even happening in Scunthorpe. So the idea of commandeering spaces within our towns and cities to reclaim the notion of urban food production is something that is really exciting. In Paris, the Mayor Anne Hidalgo, part of her commitment is she's taken out 70,000 car parking spaces in the city to move towards to do radical reductions in pollution, but also they've given the top floors of car parks to the production of urban food often under solar roofs or solar canopies, and so they're doing that and feeding themselves in the same sort of way. And it's a much more collaborative and participative approach to including people in the notion of how we grow and feed ourselves, and also reclaiming the notion of what solidarity and security means. And this is probably the biggest challenge to politics in the UK. We are knee deep in an era which is really, since Margaret Thatcher, has seen the displacement of we in favor of me. And it used to be said that it's only the working classes who had no sense of deferred gratification, the ability to put off consuming today what we ought to wait for tomorrow. But actually, the whole of capitalism now is an abandonment of deferred gratification. It's all about consuming ourselves to death now. And, the whole waste culture, the absence of any notion of commitments to recycling, all of this just goes out of the window. And it isn't rocket science to do things differently. Again, let me finish on the one example from my childhood. Money was often short, but pocket money could get supplemented at that time. If you went round the street, neighbours asking if they had any lemonade bottles that they wanted returning, because you could get 3 pence on a bottle that you returned. And that was a great way of supplementing pocket money, actually getting pocket money at times. And it worked. Now, you think all this sense of waste and just a throwaway culture for containers that we have, could we do it differently? And the answer is, look at Norway. Because in 2006, Norway pulled in all the plastics manufacturers and said, we can't be doing with all this waste. We're going to introduce a whopping great tax on plastic containers. And they're all, oh, no, you can't do it. And they said, but we're going to give you an exemption. We will offer an exemption to plastic containers that can be recycled. And they said, well, how do we? And they said, you go away and you come back, and if there's, you can produce a list of plastic containers that can be genuinely recycled, they'll be exempt. So they did. They came back in the end with 3 types of plastic containers which were to be exempt. And they said, the government said, okay, that's great, but you've actually, to get the tax exemption, you've actually got to do the recycling. And so what you now have is their containers are all barcoded, and pretty much at the end of every street with shops on it or precinct, there's like a vending machine where you take your plastic containers, you put them in, it reads the barcode, and when you finish whatever number of returns, you don't get cash, you get a credit note, and that credit note can be used as cash in any of the shops in Norway. And since they introduced that, 2006, they made the condition that the industry only got tax exemptions if there were more than 90% of the containers that actually were recycled. Since then, they're now running at 97% recycling. We're around 15% if we're lucky. But all you have to do is reach out and use the technologies that we have today to replicate the approaches that we had yesterday. It just needs a sense of vision and circularity. And this is my final point. I think what Labour scares me about when we talk as an alternative to the Conservatives is the notion that we will drive growth. And growth is about consuming more and more of things that we have less and less of. And the real alternative for a different politics is to embrace the idea of circularity, that we have to recognize that actually spending more money in the economy isn't a problem if that money creates jobs in the localities, and if those jobs then spend in the localities, that the money go round works within the locality. So when people say we couldn't do that because it would cost 2 billion quid, I don't have any objections to an extra 2 billion quid circulation around your economy. because that will generate security and work and well-being and the notions of inclusion. It's the money that gets drained out of the economy that becomes problematic. And so we need to be looking inwards and not thinking that we somehow have to find new markets to exploit other people somewhere else in order to pursue the false promise of everlasting consumption growth. Now we need to be looking at ways of providing security and inclusion for ourselves that will deliver a way of surviving the roller coaster that we're already on, and not finding ourselves or throwing ourselves or our kids or our grandkids off the ride because there is no comfortable landing for them. And I think that's a challenge to those of you who, like me, have maybe getting longer in the years, but we don't have to get longer and more jaded in our dreams. And we just have to say that that's the challenge that could still save us all. That's me.
Thank you, Alan. Excellent, excellent. I'll be inviting people to sort of ask questions. I'm presuming you're going to be staying around for a question and answer session.
Sure.
I did send out a notice because I was expecting I'd forgotten about the World Cup, I grant you, and I'd expected one or two more people to be attending. They may well be on the live stream. I don't know. I'm not monitoring the numbers there. But I'll invite people to ask a few questions. I have posted in the chat a couple of things that might be sort of relevant for people to check out. There's the deep adaptation from Jeb Bentel, a professor in Cumbria, that might be of relevance to people that they might want to actually sort of check out and see what he's talking about in relation to the climate emergency. There's also a leaflet from Left Horizons, which is this one. If you can see it, I don't know if you can see it or not. It's basically called Climate Emergency, Labour's Green New Deal and Socialism. It was produced in 2019, but if you read through it, it's still relevant to what we need to be doing today. So that's in the chat for people to jump on the link and be able to sort of check out at the later date. A couple of things I'm concerned about in relation to this topic, Alan, and maybe you can answer these questions. I did a speech to the local council, Bexley, sort of in April. And one of the things I pointed out was the fact that because of the amount of sort of heat warming that's going on above pre-industrial levels, that over the next century, if we carry on at the rate we're going, there will suddenly be an uplift in the amount of sort of conversion from ice to water in the poles. And it's talking in terms of, in the next 100 years, there being a 16-foot increase in sea levels. Now, if that 16-foot increase happens, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd have to be sitting in a boat because of the amount of water that would come from the Thames and sort of overlap quite a lot of this area. But the thing I'm concerned about is the fact that most of our food is generated on coastal areas. And when we're importing food, most of our sort of infrastructure will be on rivers and coastal areas, which will be underwater. So you've outlined some of the ways that we can deal locally with sort of those issues, but how can we actually try and arrest some of those sort of issues in relation? How can we convince people that, you know, it's not a bogus event, climate emergency, that it is something real? I mean, we've got people at COP27 from Tuvalu that were trying to persuade the world to actually sort of take on board their concerns and their worries, because they're going to be having to move from Tuvalu to somewhere else. And we're going to have all of that sort of dislocation because of populations shifting from where they can no longer reside to other places. So how do we deal with that? Do we have anything in place for that? I mean, most of the ideas you've come through with today, you're probably one of the few people that are actually not only spoken about the problems, but how there are potential solutions there. And you've actually given some excellent examples as well. So maybe you could sort of address that. Nobody's got their hands up at the moment. Everybody's shy at asking questions in this group to start off with. So maybe you can sort of give us a little bit of an overview in relation to that one, if you can.
Okay. I think what we have to do is to just take examples of the flooding and devastation elsewhere. And, you know, Pakistan, for me, was one of the most moving ones this year, just because of the sheer numbers of people who were just displaced from where they lived, and in floods that swept everything away, not just the crops, but their cattle as well. And you're right, there are no farming solutions, food solutions in situations like that, when you on that sort of scale. However, it's really sort of heartening to see that if you step aside slightly, in Bangladesh, that is, you know, where they're used to those sorts of floods on a more regular basis, there's a really interesting approach to farming whereby the farmers construct these sort of reed beds that are, I'm trying to think how best to describe them. They're probably about 4 foot wide, and maybe, you know, 50 meters long, and they're about half a meter or more deep, and they are floating vegetable beds. So they put the soil in there, and they put the crops in there, and, you know, as and where the land floods, you know, that the whole plant bed rises, and the water then that drains through provides nutrients back into the soil below. But the actual crops are able to survive, and even if they're wading in to get access to them for harvesting and weeding, whatever, they rise with the tide. They survive the floods, and that's a very innovative approach to dealing with events that, you know, from this distance we can neither control nor avert. So we need to provide support for communities in other places that come up with their own innovative approaches to providing crops that will, or crop solutions that will survive that sort of flooding. Drought is another end of that spectrum. And again, some of the poorest areas of the planet are coming up with quite innovative ways of harvesting moisture in areas that are classed as semi-deserts, because they create canopies where there is condensation that comes out of the really deep cold of the evening and the night. The moisture, what moisture there is in the air, actually drains through into very shallow wells that they then have sort of submerged slightly into the ground, so that the water that's gathered doesn't then evaporate during the day, but they can harvest and use that. And in energy terms, you know, the other thing that has always stayed with me was I met a guy in my own constituency who ran a solar, a wind turbine company, and you know, they were doing really well. And I said to him, "What are your plans? What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to hand the business over to my sons when I realised my dream." I said, "Okay, what's your dream?" And he said, "I just, as soon as I've sorted out the 6-donkey wind turbine, then I'll hand it over." And I was a bit floored by this, and I said, "Wasn't sure donkeys had much of a role in wind turbine. What's this?" And he said, "No, I want to create a wind turbine that can be in 6 separate parts, each of which can be transported by a donkey. Because as soon as I've got that, I can take the whole thing back to the village in India that I came from, and I can put this up, and we'll have a wind-based generating system that will provide lighting and heating for the rest of the village." And so that's what I'm going to be doing. And I thought, well, that is really, really smart. You don't have to be working at the level of a 6 gigawatt wind turbine stuck out in the North Sea, which can only be built by a company with access to massive finance and is so offshore that it's not going to be run on a community cooperative basis. But this uses smart technology to turn the thing to the other end and have solutions that are locally available, locally accountable, and locally owned. And I think that's, again, where we have to start to pull those sorts of ideas into the process. And my final one is that there's in terms of the slow food movement, the European slow food movement, it actually began in 1986 by a guy called Carlo Petrini. And since then, they've run an annual an international slow food convention in Torino called the Salone del Gusto. And they bring together slow food communities from all around the world. An astonishing bit of event, all about, there isn't a corporation amongst them. They're all about local food collectives. And what they've started to do is not just share the nature of how they produce and what they produce, and you have fantastic, food stores all around the place, but they're sharing their knowledge of different climate conditions. And what they've begun to realize is that this isn't just abstract and anecdotal, but in a sense, each one of them has a food culture, a climate history that may not be their climate future. As things are changing, our future climate conditions aren't going to be the ones that I grew up with, the much more regular, knowable seasonality of things. But it will become much more turbulent. Now, there's food communities in other parts of the planet that already are used to dealing with that sort of turbulence and the how of growing things in different ways. And so again, we need to work out how to share that knowledge and pass it round in ways that just recognize the interdependency of lives and resources. And in terms of actually liberating the international resources to do this, we've got to move beyond the stage that was agreed at COP27, because my fear is that in a world where you're going from one area of economic crisis to another, you're not going to get nation states stepping up and saying, well, we'll put our hands in our pockets and we'll meet the bill for reparations elsewhere. But domestic politics is going to make that ugly and resented. So my argument is, look at where the money is at the moment. The people who are making money hand over fist are those who are either the big owners of the corporate food chains, most of which are dominated now internationally, food trade, by 7 food conglomerates. And beyond that, it's the financial speculators who just gamble on food prices and aim to make money out of all. The real opportunity is to say, go back to what Keynes wanted in 1947, when setting up the UN and the World Bank and the IMF. Keynes's view was that the World Bank should have been the United Nations Bank and no one else's. And it was to provide ways of redistributing resources to include different parts of the world so that we use food security to avoid the basis of having food scarcity as the precondition for conflict and war. And if you want to do that now, the simplest way is to do what James Tobin argued, the economist, and have a Tobin tax of 0.1% tax on all speculative transactions. It's a minute fraction of a tax. But when you think that these trades are going on 10, 20, 100 per second, every short-term transaction that generated a gain for someone would have a sliver taken off. And there is more than enough money to meet the entirety of the planet's food security and clean post-carbon economics. But you have to tax the casino, not the community. That is the way of financing that.
Thank you, Alan. That's an excellent answer. I'm going to bring in Ferdy now because nobody else has got their hands up at the moment. So we'll ask Ferdy to sort of come in with his question, if you don't mind. Ferdy, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Alan, for your presentation. Now, there's so much to say, but I'm going to restrict myself to focusing on just a few very important things, except to say that, we're fast moving on to passing tipping points now. The Paris Agreement was on 1.5 by 2050. We all know that that's a fallacy now. We will go well beyond 1.5% within the next decade if things carry on the way it is. Now, the planet at 1.2 degrees heating basically is in a free fall to we see in Pakistan all the heat waves, the droughts, the forest fires. We can now see that there is forest fires in the Arctic. What will it be like when we reach with the next generation, children who are born today, who will be in their lifetime facing potentially 3 degrees? What will the planet be like for them? So nobody in this meeting will disagree that we are in an absolute emergency. Now, having said that, I'll just pick up, don't agree with everything that Ed Miliband says, but I agree with him. It is cheaper to save the planet today than to destroy it. So why are we heading in that direction? We have to say that what we're dealing with is criminality. The government, hand in hand with the fossil fuel companies, we are subsidizing fossil fuel to stay in business, basically. There is a lot of exciting technologies that are coming about, and it's cheaper to produce renewables now. And we are actually moving on to hydrogen now. And the oil companies are working out to keep the kind of hydrogen that will use fossil fuel to produce. Whereas if we went on to green hydrogen through government investment, we could actually through economies of scale, actually produce and bridge the gap between the renewables the renewables that are intermittent to actually come in and use hydrogen to bridge the gap, basically. So there are so many exciting things that can happen. And it is cheap, and I agree with Ed Miliband that it is cheaper to save the planet than not. But what do we see at COP27? We've seen all the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, actually sending all the lobbyists. There were more, we read recently that there were more fossil fuel lobbyists than the 10 all the delegates of the 10 countries that were suffering the worst calamities at the moment in the planet, basically. So what do? The government is literally banning the development of renewable energy. So any developments in the renewable energy in this country is in spite of the government, although they're boasting about it. We see the campaign group, powerful people, basically campaigning to do away with all the regulations to stop onshore wind power. We've seen, for example, we've heard Liz Truss express her opinion about solar panels, not much different from Donald Trump's, where wind power, the wind generators going wow, 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 and then everybody catches cancer. So they're still in the pockets of the oil. So we have to fight. So I'm coming to my question now, which is you disagreed with the direct action being taken by groups like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. So you feel that the Just Stop Oil should be focusing not sort of disrupting the public, but to basically target the fossil fuel companies. Now, I would disagree with you there, because if we target, I mean, if you yourself said that you try to sort of any sort of communication you had with Ed Miliband was quite quickly cut, because they don't want you to get involved. They don't want to be seen with people like us, basically, who are very serious about the taking action. So what chance without non-violent direct action would we have in A, creating public awareness, B, moving the government from their criminal act? The media is not on our side. We seem to be getting, when we do take direct action, we seem to be getting more publicity. When someone went onto the bridge in Dartford, there was immediately 500,000 Twitter feed within the first hour. So to a lot of people who are in Extinction Rebellion, they feel, I mean, I myself I'm one, and we're doing outreach, and we do sense from the public they do support us. They feel that at least someone's taking some action.
Okay,
so,
thank you, Ferdy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ferdy. Alan, we haven't got anyone else with their hand up at the moment. I was going to sort of have it organised so that we had three. Oh, Richard Crook's got a question, so we'll go to Richard and have at least 2 questions to answer. So, Richard, sorry for cutting you off there, Ferdy. I'm trying to keep people to 2 or 3 minutes.
I was just going to say, Alan, that was excellent presentation. Have you written a book on this, or if not, could you point us, perhaps via David, to some decent books that you've learned from? Because I'm rather interested in this subject, like lots of us, and any particular websites that you think would be helpful. And but no, thanks once again. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Alan.
Yeah, let me come straight back on Richard's point. I've got a real butterfly mind, so I dig into all sorts of obscure places, and I try to write a lot about them in articles, many of which are published by the Morning Star and other sort of magazines. But if you wanted to go back through some of them, I've now put most of them on my website, which is just alansimpson.org.uk. And there's lots of the articles there which try to link us back into different cultures and different examples, both from the present and the past, of radical change, which is also based on interdependency, common security and innovation, and thinking about things differently. So this can go back to the Iroquois tribes, who for me have had, for the last 200 years, have had probably the best constitution ever written, because the way that people fell out with each other, and people would scrap and they'd have fights, and people would get killed and stuff, but they never went to war with each other. And what happened is that the annual gathering of the Iroquois tribes, their annual powwow, actually had to make decisions. But those decisions, they write this constitution, which is called the Great Law of Peace. And it says that every decision that is made by effectively their parliament has to show that it is in the interests of the next 7 generations. If you look at our parliament, you'd be lucky to get commitment to anything that would last for the next 7 minutes. But this is the notion of intergenerational responsibilities that we've got to reclaim, and we can do, and we just need to reach out and reclaim things that others have been doing in a more responsible way. So lots of my articles try to go down that path of looking at bits from ancient cultures and also from modern practices, like the Danish idea of, by law, having energy as a service, not as a market. These are heresies that I keep trying to offer to the Labour Party, but at the moment it's a closed doors approach. But let me come back then to on to Ferdy's point. I'm not opposed to direct action, and I think all the direct action that is taken to try to flag up the real sense of the crisis that we're facing is helpful. What I was saying is that maybe we just need to have either a different or an additional focus, because all those lobbyists that were in COP27, many of them are based in the UK. Lots of them have, luxurious lifestyles. They live in comfortable homes. Well, why aren't we on their doorsteps? Why aren't we outside the school gates where they send their kids to school? Why aren't we saying, is it right? Are you happy that your neighbor is going to kill off the kids in this street? Because that's what they're pushing for. That's the direction. That's the Armageddon line that's taken by Mr. So-and-so, 54, whatever the street. And you do make it intrusive and you do make it personal, but you target the people who are acting as the go-betweens for the fossil fuel industry, and you make life uncomfortable for those who are directly responsible for or lobbying for all the things that will accelerate us towards the precipice that if we go over, there's no coming back from. So, I'm just saying that is not to be at odds with XR or Just Stop Oil. It's to actually admit an admiration for them, but it's to say, if we really want to influence, then we've got to ask ourselves, beyond publicity, how is this changing anything? And it's a difficult one to ask. I'm doing a series of talks at Nottingham University at the moment on COP27 and beyond. And last week there it came up, in terms of the strikes organised by the academic staff. There are very large amounts of support from other staff and from the students, but the staff were saying, but by and large, the administration just ignore us. And what can we do? And I said, well, we've got this fantastically beautiful campus in Nottingham University, but there are campuses in Southeast Asia that have started to say, if we're serious about food security, maybe we need to use part of our campus for an organic garden. And they're building them, huge organic gardens that are incorporated into parts of the syllabus of different courses. So I said, well, next time you're going to take industrial action, just tell the Vice Chancellor you're going to dig up the campus and invite some of the allotment holders to come and be part of it. Just, yes, be disruptive, but be constructively disruptive. And that's what I'm saying. We have to become propositionalists and not just oppositionalists in the way that we think about the future. If we want to save it, we have to be offering a better alternative, as well as a break on all that is destructive and that's happening now. And part of this, I think, goes into the conversations about energy systems. There's going to be lots of different claims, and some of them will work brilliantly and some won't, and that's okay. But I think, in a sense, we need to bring a rigor to what it is that will make a difference. One of the reasons I've been not skeptical, but I'm very limited in my belief at the moment about how far hydrogen is the answer, is that we've got to move away from the notion that an energy system basically goes from, it's a one-way street from a power station to your plug in your home, and in which we are just, the passive consumers of what comes out of the plug. And all of the economic arguments that I've seen so far say that if you want a role for hydrogen, it's probably going to be in the production of steel, so that we replace coking coal with hydrogen to produce high quality steel. But it makes no sense to be thinking about that as the sort of domestic alternative to the current use of gas. We have much better, more sustainable solutions that are also susceptible to more localized control, accountability, and to have a skill base of training to deliver employment security and skill-based security for the kids in our localities who want to be part of the answer rather than just an additional part of the problem. So yes, embrace all of the possibilities, but we need to be saying to ourselves, where in all of that, where is the sense of democratic and localized, decentralized control and accountability that will deliver the security for whole communities to feel that they are co-owners of the solutions and not just consumers on a market that they have no other control over.
Thank you for that, Alan. Can I ask you another question? I mean, nobody's got their hands up at the moment, so I'm going to dive in anyway. You talk about not being oppositional, but being propositional. How would you propose dealing with our current parliamentary system in those terms? Because we've got Starmer, who is, as far as I can see, just leading the second 11 Tories, and we've got the Tories there that are sort of out and out sort of right wingers who are not interested in climate emergency at all. They will pay lip service to it, but they have no interest at all. When I was proposing a climate emergency motion at Bexley Council, that they actually sort of finally, after 3 years, the climate emergency was dealt with. I first put the motion forward in May 2019, and I was able to deal with it in April 2022. But they then actually sort of put an amendment to it, which completely sort of negated anything in relation to climate emergency whatsoever. Now, we've got exactly the self-same sort of attitude of Tories in our government. And I don't see Starmer, even though today he'll probably pronounce on the Labour Party Green New Deal and tomorrow he'll disown it. So you never can tell which way he's going to jump from one day to the next. So how do we actually manage to get from just simply oppositional to propositional in our government?
Yeah,
for the people around this room that are activists in politics locally.
Okay. For my sins, I'm still an advisor to the All Party Group on the Green New Deal, and we've got these hearings currently going on under Clive Lewis and Caroline Lucas. And a lot of the stuff that's coming out is brilliant, some fantastic ideas. But you're right in questioning how far this travels into official Labour Party thinking. And there's a dilemma there. I mean, I would love to get shut of the Tories. And I thought Liz Truss was well on track to doing that for me. But by the same token, do I want an election now? In my heart, I have huge fears about that, because I could see Labour being swept into power, but on a programme that really is not going to come up with any of the transformative answers that we now need. And a lot of the stuff that is being rolled out is very good as a critique of the mess that the Tories are making, but it isn't the visionary alternative that we need. It's still reformative arguments in a system that is still inexorably racing towards the cliff edge. So my worry is that if we had an election tomorrow, we'd get a Labour government, and Keir Starmer could actually then destroy the Labour Party, because if we carried on running with the mess, it would be a very short honeymoon indeed before the press turned round and actually started to blame Labour for all the catastrophic mess that we would inherit, and our inability to make it right within a reformist agenda would end up with Labour being blamed for everything. And then if the public deserted us in droves, I think they would go into a very ugly space politically, which was divisive amongst ourselves, divisive against outsiders. And we could see ourselves descending into some very ugly politics of fragmentation for survival. So that is my worry, and I share, the implications of what you're saying, Dave. So what can we do about it? Well, I think we have to work to try to influence the fragments that we can do. And I'll just give you some examples out of this. One of the things that's come out of some of the talks I've been doing is that for my sins, I've also been part of a thing called the Schools Energy Co-op for the last decade when we set it up. And basically, we help schools and local authorities or local communities set up energy co-ops, putting solar roofs on their schools. And we can be doing that in pretty much any and every part of the country. Actually, we've been more successful in doing this in schools around London than we have further north. But I've just got now 3 different consortia of schools around Nottingham, one in Newark, one in the Gedling area, and one in the Broxtowe area outside the city, with 4 or 5 schools in each. And we will be helping to set up energy cooperatives, community energy co-ops, and the local community will be the owners of the cooperative of the solar array, for which they'll be paid, I think, somewhere between 4 and 5% interest on whatever savings they put into it. For the schools, bear in mind what's happening to energy costs in schools. At the moment, their bills are capped at 35 pence a kilowatt, but after the 6 months and the cap comes off, all schools will probably join those who weren't covered, but who were now on contracts where their cost is about 85 to 90 pence a kilowatt. And this is causing absolutely a pandemonium in schools, because they're having to talk about running half time. So maybe some groups coming in mornings, others coming in afternoons, closing down half the school, just not having the budget to be able to function. With the co-op, what we're able to do is, usually, depending on the size of the school roof, but for primary schools which have smaller roof spaces, we're able to supply electricity at between 13 and 20 pence a kilowatt. So that is about almost a third of the current capped price. And for the larger secondary schools, we're able to supply electricity at around somewhere between 10 and 13 pence a kilowatt. So that is, bigger savings still. And so what we're doing is we're getting people in, and the nature of the co-ops start with the first offer going to the families who are in the schools. The second tranche comes of entitlements, it comes to the communities around the school. The third is to the locality, the local authority area that the school is in. And only if the costs of putting in the solar roof aren't covered by subscriptions from there does it go to a wider trawl. The reality is that every share issue that has been put out has been oversubscribed, usually within the first 2 weeks. So it is possible to do this in ways that radically cut the school's electricity costs and give a sense of the community being able to find safe places to save, and collectively doing something that cuts the carbon footprint of what they're doing, because it is, you know, it just self-evidently a better way of delivering clean energy. And it brings the conversation about practical interventions to do something at a locality level that is seen to be addressing the climate emergency, and, you know, in a positive and constructive way. And that can be done anywhere and everywhere. And, you know, the key is you've got to have the support of the head teacher who wants to make it happen. It was really helpful if you can get local councillors who would help ensure that building inspectors and planning inspectors are on side with the process as well. But all of this is doable and empowering as a community clean energy process. And, you know, whether we do it in that or in the development of community food co-ops and community gardening, all of these are the practical spaces that we've got to occupy as a way of saying, you know, if we all do something in fragments between them, they will assemble a secure answer to us all. I remember Tony Benn used to, you know, regularly tell me or remind me of this fantastic story he would tell, which was a child in a village falls down the village well, and the villagers all cluster around and, you know, shout them down to check whether they're all right. And the child's okay, but he can't get out. Oh, she can't get out. And the villagers run back to their homes, come back with ropes, and they lower them down the well. And the first one's, you know, 20 foot beyond the child's reach. The next one is 15 foot beyond the reach. You know, the third is 10 foot. Fourth is, you know, 8 foot. Tantalizingly, it gets down to 2 foot beyond the child's reach, but none of the ropes are long enough. And the villagers are just, you know, absolutely desperate to know what on else they do. And this voice from the bottom of the well shouts out, "Tie your ropes together." And that's what we need to be doing as well. We need to be getting out there and helping communities do things, whether it's in food, whether it's in energy, whether it's in transport. And the message that we say is this is not only brilliant in itself, but if we can connect to others and tie those ropes together, then we have the beginnings of a bigger answer.
That's a fantastic answer. And it's right bang on time because we're now at 5:30 and we normally finish 5:30-ish.
Okay.
So it's been a fantastic talk. It's been sort of really interesting to actually come across not only sort of ideas, but actually solutions as well. I mean, that's what we're looking for. We're not just looking, I mean, Steve and I were talking earlier on today and saying, we're going to all these meetings and all you get is people talking at you, and then you go to marches and all that happens is you go on a march and then nothing happens until you go on the next march. But to actually have ideas and then solutions or potential solutions, that's what we're actually needing now. So thank you very much, Alan, for that. That was absolutely first rate.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know whether everybody, I'll put it back on gallery so we can see if everyone's clapping or not. They should be. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Thank you, Alan. On that, I think we can end today's meeting, and it will. What I will do, Alan, is this is going to record to my computer, but it's also recording to YouTube. So now I've got to sort out the verification nonsense that's been going on with YouTube, and then we'll be able to have that. The video will download to YouTube, and it will be available as well for people to review. So,
and David, if you can find any way of putting in a reference to the website, then all the articles and examples.
Absolutely. We'll certainly get that done. Thank you, Alan, for today. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and go and enjoy the World Cup. I wasn't being serious, Stephanie. Don't start. All right, people. Thank you very much.
See you later,
Thank you as well, Dave.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ferdy. I'm sorry I had to sort of
No,
try
no.
and hurry you along with your question. But yeah. Okay.
That's good.
All right. Bye-bye, people.
Okay, ciao.
All right.